Quảng Trị was never meant to be a battlefield. Not like this. Not the kind that would scar the land so deeply that even decades later, old craters still filled with water every rainy season, and villagers still uncovered rusted shell fragments in their fields. Quảng Trị, the northernmost province of South Vietnam, lived under constant tension. Its people had grown used to distant artillery thumps, the rumble of convoys, the hum of reconnaissance aircraft. But even in the hardest years of the war, no one imagined the province would become the center of one of the longest, bloodiest sieges in modern military history. But in the early morning hours of March 30th, 1972, the world changed. It began with a tremor, just a low rolling vibration that moved under the earth, enough to wake a few soldiers from light sleep. Then came the second tremor, then a third. And then, without warning, the entire northern horizon exploded in orange light as more than hundreds of North Vietnamese artillery tubes opened fire at once. The bombardment was so intense that it lit the dawn sky like a false sunrise. People who remembered it would later say it sounded like the earth itself was ripping open. South Vietnamese positions near the DMZ were immediately engulfed. Outposts that had held for years vanished under the barrage. Bunkers shook, sandbags disintegrated, trees snapped, radios screamed with overlapping distress calls. Whole units disappeared from the map within minutes. It was the opening blow of what would become known as the Easter Offensive, one of the largest conventional attacks of the war. And Quảng Trị was ground zero. ARVN soldiers of the 3rd Division, already stretched thin, already exhausted from months of skirmishes, ran to defensive positions in the chaos, pulling on helmets, loading magazines, diving behind the nearest cover as shells fell like rain. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by explosions. Dust filled the air so thickly it became a kind of fog. The smell of burning wood and cordite mixed into a choking cloud that stung the eyes. At Firebase Pedro, one of the northernmost ARVN strongpoints, Captain Le Ming Zung grabbed the radio handset with trembling hands, trying to maintain contact with regiments already reporting mass casualties. "Hold your positions! Reinforcements are—" His words were cut off by another barrage. This one closer, so strong it shook the ground like thunder. Several men fell as the bunker wall cracked. A young soldier cried out for his mother as debris covered him. The captain wiped dust from his face, coughing hard, and repeated the same order. Not because he believed it, but because it was his duty. Yet the truth was clear. This was not another skirmish. This was an invasion. By mid-morning, thousands of NVA troops were pouring across the DMZ and through the mountains west of Quảng Trị. This was not the guerrilla war Americans had been used to years earlier. These were conventional forces, armored units, anti-aircraft regiments, artillery battalions, all moving with frightening speed and coordination. Villagers saw the long columns of NVA soldiers marching past rice paddies, past shrines, past crumbling walls still marked by older battles. People hid in homes and bunkers, in drainage ditches. Some prayed, some fled. Others simply watched, stunned, because there was nowhere else to run. For South Vietnamese forces, the shock was overwhelming. Whole lines collapsed. Strongpoints fell one by one. The defensive belt north of Quảng Trị City cracked under the weight of the assault and began to crumble.
And yet, even as chaos spread, a small number of ARVN officers desperately tried to organize a defense. Inside Quảng City, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Civilians crowded the streets, pushing carts loaded with bedding, clothes, children, anything they could carry. Motorbikes weaved through the crowd. Soldiers sprinted between defensive points. The air echoed with both distant artillery and the constant wail of families searching for missing children. The provincial headquarters became a hurricane of activity. Officers were shouting into radios, trying to reach units that were either retreating, surrounded, or already destroyed. Maps were spread over tables, covered in scribbled arrows and red circles. Some officers paced anxiously, others stared blankly, stunned by how quickly the enemy had advanced. General Vu Van Giai, commander of the 3rd ARVN Division, stood over the operations map with clenched fists. He was a proud officer, disciplined, calm under pressure. But even he struggled to process the scale of what was happening. "How many tanks did you say?" he asked one of his staff officers. "At least a dozen, sure. But reports say more are coming." Tanks. Not hit-and-run ambush teams, not sappers infiltrating at night. Tanks. The appearance of NVA T-54s and PT-76s meant the enemy had committed to a full-scale assault. General GI looked at the map again. His lines were collapsing. Key fire bases had gone silent. He had nowhere near the manpower needed to stop a mechanized force this size. But giving up the city was unthinkable. Quảng Trị was the northern shield of the Republic of Vietnam. If it fell, the road to Hue would be open.
The morning the 3rd Division realized the walls were closing in began like so many others that April, hot, humid, and trembling with the distant rumble of artillery. It was still early, the sun only just rising above the low ridgeline to the west, but the sky already carried a red haze. Dust and moisture hung in the air in a strange, metallic fog that tasted of cordite. The soldiers of the ARVN 3rd Division, the newest, least prepared, and arguably most unfortunate division in the entire Army of the Republic of Vietnam, moved through their bunkers and trenches with the tired, hollow rhythm of men who understood that the day ahead would not be kind. For weeks, intelligence reports had been conflicting. Some officers swore the North Vietnamese army was already massing north of the province. Others insisted the buildup was exaggerated. A few believed the real attack would come elsewhere. Maybe Hue, maybe Da Nang, maybe even the Central Highlands. But by late April, the truth was impossible to deny. Radio intercepts had spiked. Artillery strikes had grown more precise. Recon units returned with stories of columns of PAVN troops moving through the jungles under cover of darkness, bypassing outposts that were once considered secure. Still, it wasn't until that morning, when the Division Operations Center at I-2 Combat Base received a flurry of panicked calls from forward companies, that the true scale of the danger became clear. The first call came from a company commander stationed along the northern perimeter. His voice cracked with static, but the urgency behind it cut through the noise. Movement! Many, many troops coming through the trees. No, not platoon strength. Battalion, maybe more. Requesting artillery fire immediately. Now, now, now! Minutes later, a second report arrived from the coastal flank. Enemy bypassed the river line. They're closing in. Multiple directions. Too many to count. Then a third, almost whispered, "They're behind us! They're behind us!" That was the moment Brigadier General Vu Van Giai, commanding officer of the 3rd Division, felt a cold shock run through him. He had suspected the NVA's intention to encircle Quảng Trị, but the speed at which it had happened defied all expectations. The defensive belts, thin, understrength, and staffed with green recruits, had collapsed faster than anyone could have predicted. The 56th Regiment was buckling, the 57th was exhausted, and the 2nd Battalion of the 11th Armored Cavalry, once thought to be the division's mobile fire brigade, was already bogged down, retreating from one broken defensive position to another. By mid-morning, the truth was undeniable. The 3rd Division was surrounded. Soldiers looked out across the fields and tree lines and could see them, dark shapes moving in the heat haze, the silhouettes of helmets and rifles shifting between the palms. Machine gun bursts flickered like fireflies. Mortar round thumped into the ground with a dull, earth-shaking roar. The PAVN had closed the ring. For the men of the 3rd Division, many of whom had been in uniform for only a few months, the realization hit with a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. Some stood frozen, staring northward as the distant figures multiplied. Others muttered prayers, clutching their rosaries or the small photographs they kept tucked into their helmets. A few joked nervously. Soldiers' humor, crude and absurd, the kind that tries to hold fear at bay for just one more minute. The perimeter began to constrict almost immediately. On the western flank, companies reported they were taking mortar fire from 2 different angles at once, an impossibility only days earlier when the enemy was believed to be far north of the province. The 56th Regiment radio operator described it best. It felt like they were pouring in from every direction, like the jungle itself had turned against us. The PAVN had rehearsed this operation for months. They moved with frightening discipline, small units advancing, halting, firing, then vanishing again. Sniper fire cracked through the air, forcing the ARVN soldiers to stay low. Entire platoons were pinned down in trenches too shallow to offer real protection. General Zhai ordered the artillery batteries at Aitu to fire at maximum range, to break the tightening noose. The guns roared to life, shaking the ground underfoot. Thin clouds of dust drifted down from the steel rafters. Spent shells clattered across the sandbags like coins being poured onto a table. But artillery alone could not stop what was coming. To the north, the NVA's 304th Division, battle-hardened from Laos and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, pressed toward the city. To the west, elements of the 308th Division swung wide, cutting off the roads that led to Hue. And to the east, sappers slipped through villages, blowing bridges and minesweeping routes that the ARVN might use to escape. Within hours, every approach route had been compromised. The 3rd Division bunker complex grew louder. Radios hissed. Telephones rang without pause. Officers ran between map boards and radio consoles, trying to match the flood of reports to the chaotic reality outside. The division's operations map, once neat and orderly, now looked like a series of bleeding ink lines where enemy units seemed to materialize in impossible numbers. Then came the report that confirmed their worst fear. All major roads leading south were under enemy control. For the first time, the phrase slipped into the conversation at command level, quietly at first, almost a whisper. "We are encircled." Outside the command center, the soldiers felt it too. Artillery shells from the north began to fall with greater frequency. The PAVN's gunners were skilled and fearless, shifting their aim in tight patterns to suppress the ARVN's defensive gun pits. The ground erupted again and again, showering men with dirt. The smell of gunpowder seeped into everything, their uniforms, their hair, the very air they breathed. At the forward bunkers, privates and corporals who had never seen real combat before stared out at the hazy shapes of approaching soldiers. They saw PAVN helmets dipping and rising behind the brush, the brief flash of bayonets catching sunlight. They heard whistles and shouts echoing through the trees, and every minute The ring drew closer. A platoon leader, Lieutenant Pom Hui, crouched behind a low wall with only a dozen men left in his unit. "Are we holding?" one of his soldiers asked, his voice shaking. "We're holding," Hui said, though he didn't believe it. Behind them, civilians streamed southward, farmers, mothers, children, carrying what little they could salvage. The scream of artillery overhead made them duck as one. The city of Quảng Trị, already rattled by weeks of bombardment, had begun to empty. By midday, the encirclement tightened further. The sound of ARVN loudspeakers drifted across the battlefield. Strange, eerie music, followed by commands urging the ARVN to surrender. Few paid attention. Most were too busy firing, reloading, and praying. At I2, General Zhai stood over the map with his senior officers. Their faces were gray with exhaustion. "They came faster than expected," Colonel Tuong said. "They came everywhere," another officer replied. Zhai exhaled slowly. "We must prevent a total collapse." But even as he said the words, the reports continued. "The northern perimeter is gone. The eastern villages are lost. 56th Regiment requesting emergency extraction. Enemy tanks sighted on Route 1. Civilians flooding past our lines, thousands of them. We can't hold much longer." Outside the base, the crack of gunfire drew nearer. The PAVN was pushing close enough that several bullets struck the outer walls. Small holes appeared in the concrete, spraying dust into the operations center. A young supply sergeant inside the bunker looked up at the ceiling, then back at the entrance where soldiers rushed past. "Sir, are we completely surrounded?" No one answered him. The truth hung in the air, unspoken.
The encirclement of the 3rd Division settled like a tightening band around I2 combat base, and by late afternoon, the air over Quảng Trị province vibrated with a kind of constant, oppressive thunder. Artillery barrages rolled in waves, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, thumping across the ground like a giant's heartbeat. The sky, once bright, had turned the color of old brass. Smoke drifted in long, ragged curtains that stung the eyes and clung to the tongue. Even the birds had gone silent. At the forward line, the NVA continued closing in with methodical, steady movements that unnerved even seasoned soldiers. Their discipline was unmistakable, small groups advancing under covering fire, pausing to disappear into thickets and shell holes, then emerging again with the precision of a single vast organism. The jungle swallowed and revealed them in rhythm, as though nature itself had sided with them. Inside I2, General Zhai knew the worst was still ahead. The operations table showed red arrows pressing inward from every direction. The NVA had not simply surrounded them, they were splitting the 3rd Division into pieces, isolating regiments so they could be crushed one by one. Already the 57th Regiment reported being cut into 3 fragments. The 56th was down to half strength. The 2nd Armored Squadron was running low on fuel and ammunition, forced to ration both as the ring of enemy troops cut off their resupply routes. The division's officers tried to remain calm, but their faces betrayed the truth. Every new radio transmission seemed to confirm what they feared most. The fall of Quảng Trị was becoming inevitable. At 1500 hours, the first armored contact was reported. An NVA tank, its silhouette unmistakably that of a PT-76 amphibious light tank, pushed onto Route 1, firing several rounds toward an ARVN outpost before retreating behind cover. The fact that armor had appeared this early was a shock. For years, ARVN troops in the northern provinces had heard rumors that the North Vietnamese were moving tanks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but seeing one on their doorstep was something else entirely. A platoon leader radioed in an incredulous message. "Sir, they have tanks! Tanks!" The stun in his voice said everything. Moments later, the artillery officer at I2 received confirmation that more armored vehicles were massing near the Đông Hà bridge. If the NVA seized that bridge, and all indications were that they would, There would be no stopping their push across the province. Around 1600 hours, the heat began to fade, replaced by a cold wind blowing in from the coast. It pushed the smoke against the ground, making the entire landscape seem lower, darker, more suffocating. Soldiers coughed behind their bandanas and helmet straps. Doctors in the medical tents treated cases of smoke inhalation alongside shrapnel wounds. The wounded piled up faster than they could be evacuated. One medic, Corporal Lamb, described the scene bitterly as he knelt over a soldier whose leg had been torn apart by mortar fire. "We ran out of morphine by noon. We're giving them whatever we have. Some of them are just biting down on straps." The cries of the wounded were constant. As night approached, the flickering fires cast an eerie orange glow across the bunkers. The smell of burning grass, gunpowder, diesel, and blood blended together into a scent that seasoned war correspondents would later say they never forgot. At 1700 hours, the NVA attacked again. This time it was a coordinated assault on the northern perimeter. Hundreds of NVA troops surged forward, firing into the trenches as mortars crashed behind them. The 3rd Division's machine gunners responded, tracers streaking through the dark like red-hot needles. Several bunkers were overrun, others barely held on. Men fought hand-to-hand, sometimes in the dust at the bottoms of trenches. Lieutenant Hui, the young platoon leader who had been holding a crumbling section of the line, radioed a single breathless message. "They're in the wire!" After that, his transmission cut off. The sun dipped below the horizon. That was when the worst moment of the day arrived, the realization that the night ahead might not end. Darkness emboldened the NVA. Their sappers moved like shadows, cutting through the last strands of barbed wire and planting explosives along the outer defenses. Snipers crawled into new positions. Entire companies shifted through ravines under cover of night, leaving the ARVN guessing where the next attack would come. Inside I-2, General Jai leaned over the table, his palms flat against the cool steel surface. "We must hold the base until reinforcements arrive," he said quietly. "But sir," one officer began, "no reinforcements are close enough to reach us in time." Jai's jaw tightened. He knew the truth, but the alternative was unthinkable. Outside, the 3rd Division braced for the longest night of their lives. At 1900 hours, the first wave of night assaults hit the western flank. Machine guns sputtered into life. Grenades arced through the darkness. Flares burst overhead, briefly illuminating the battlefield in ghostly white light, revealing the silhouettes of NVA troops advancing in waves. The ARVN fought desperately, but they were exhausted, outnumbered, and disoriented. Mortars fell like rain. A bunker collapsed near the front, burying several soldiers alive. Others clawed at the dirt with bare hands, trying to reach their trapped comrades while the enemy closed in. One soldier, Private Min, would later recall the sound. "You could hear them screaming under the sandbags, but we couldn't dig fast enough. The ground kept shaking with explosions." In the south sector, the situation was no better. Civilians fleeing through the lines begged soldiers to help carry their children. Some carried only a single bag of possessions: clothes, rice, a family photograph. Others had nothing at all. Many cried as they passed through the wire. Many did not look back. Just after midnight, the NVA pressed close enough that their loudspeakers could be heard clearly. Their messages alternated between music and demands for surrender. Some ARVN soldiers shouted curses back at the loudspeakers. Others plugged their ears. A few sat silently, their eyes hollow. At 1 a.m., a section of the eastern line collapsed completely. Reports indicated that 2 companies had been overrun, their survivors scattered toward the interior of the base. Fires burned uncontrolled along the berm, casting flickering shadows across the trenches. Jai issued an order to pull surviving forces inward, tightening the defensive perimeter. Several officers objected. Such a move would concede ground to the enemy, but there was no choice. The division was bleeding strength too fast. By 3 a.m., the battle had turned into a swirl of chaos. Bullets whistled through the night, the ground shook, the screams of the wounded echoed through the bunkers, and all along the perimeter, the NVA continued their relentless push. At 4:30 a.m., the sky began to lighten. The first hint of dawn revealed bodies along the wire, both ARVN and NVA alike, lying still in the damp grass. Smoke drifted in low sheets over the battlefield. Soldiers who had fought all night shifted position with trembling hands, their eyes red and haunted. For the men of the 3rd Division, the realization came slowly, dreadfully. If the NVA attacked again at sunrise, the base might not hold. In the command bunker, General Jai stood over the map once more as a new day began. His officers waited for orders, exhausted but attentive. "We must withdraw to the south," he said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. No one argued. The encirclement had achieved its purpose. The 3rd Division had to abandon Quảng Trị, and the road south would become a new kind of battlefield, one lined with refugees, burning villages, and the relentless pursuit of the North Vietnamese army.